You know that feeling. The one where the demands just keep coming, the resources feel, well, thin, and just keeping up feels like a Herculean effort.
Oh, definitely. Modern work life, it brings its own unique set of pressures, for sure.
It really does.
What's fascinating, looking at the sources you shared, is that this isn't just about how we individually feel pressure. Uh, it's more systemic.
Right.
The work environment itself,
Yeah.
the structure, the job roles, even the schedules we keep, these are fundamental drivers of stress.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we're doing in this deep dive. We've taken this stack of sources you provided, articles, research notes, all that,
hmm
and we're going to try and unearth the key insights they offer on understanding stress, specifically within work and organizations.
Yeah, our mission really is to guide you through this material. We want to pull out let's say, the most important nuggets of knowledge,
Okay.
things that help clarify what work stress actually is, how the sources say it impacts us, and what different approaches the material suggests for grappling with it.
Makes sense.
So let's start by maybe looking at how the sources define and model this whole concept.
Okay, so when we talk about stress at work, are the sources making distinctions, like between different kinds of stress? Is it just one big bucket, or do they, break it down?
They definitely break it down. The material you shared distinguishes between organizational stress,
Okay.
which is stress caused by let's say, the broader structure, the culture, processes of the company.
All right, the big picture stuff.
Exactly. And then there's job stress, which is specifically tied to the tasks, the demands, the characteristics of your individual role.
Gotcha.
And work stress is kind of the overarching term that covers both.
Okay, so organizational stress might be something like, I don't know, navigating a really complicated internal approval process,
Mm,
while job stress is more about the demands of your specific daily tasks, like, say, as a software engineer.
precisely.
Yeah.
And to help us understand these stresses, the sources lay out several theoretical models. One of the foundational ones mentioned is the organizational role stress model.
Yeah.
This one, it comes from Kahn and colleagues, and it focuses on the demands placed on someone because of the social character or role they play within the organization.
And within that model, the sources really emphasize a few specific types of role stress, don't they? What were those again?
That's right. Yeah, the material highlights three core concepts: role conflict, role ambiguity, and role overload.
Okay.
So role conflict happens when you face two or more demands that are just incompatible. You can't satisfy all of them at the same time.
Like, needing to finish a critical report by 5 p.m., but also being urgently pulled into an unscheduled client call that goes way past 5.
Exactly that kind of situation. Then there's role ambiguity,
Okay.
which is when your duties, your responsibilities, maybe your goals, or just the expectations aren't clearly communicated or defined by those above you.
So if you're maybe a new project manager and you're not sure if you're supposed to be doing the scheduling yourself or if the team lead handles that, that's role ambiguity.
Yes, or even just being unclear about the overall objectives for your role this quarter.
Right, right.
And finally, role overload is pretty straightforward. It's having too much to do.
hmm
The sources break this down a bit further into quantitative overload, which is simply having too many tasks or maybe too little time or resources.
Just sheer volume.
Right. And qualitative overload, which is
Yeah.
feeling like you lack the skills or ability to meet the demands, even if you technically have enough time.
Got it. Okay, so the role stress model is really about the pressures and expectations tied to your specific position. What about the person environment fit model? How do the sources describe that one?
Right. So this model suggests stress arises from a mismatch between the individual and their work environment.
Okay.
So if your skills and abilities don't align well with the demands of the job, or maybe if the job environment doesn't meet your needs or values, you experience stress.
So the bigger the gap.
The greater the stress.
Well said.
Exactly.
Like someone who, say, thrives on independent work being put into a highly collaborative, constant meeting environment. That mismatch could cause significant stress, even if they're technically capable of the tasks.
That's a great example.
Mm.
Yeah. Then we get to one of probably the most frequently cited models in the material, the job demands control model,
Mm.
sometimes called the job strain model.
This is the one focused on high demands but low control, isn't it?
Yeah.
How does that dynamic create stress, according to the sources?
Well, the core idea is that strain results from the combination of high psychological demands and low decision latitude,
Decisional attitude.
meaning having sort of sufficient skills and, crucially, the authority to make decisions about how you do your work.
Right.
The sources argue that high demands paired with insufficient control over how to meet those demands is particularly stressful. They use this example comparing nurses and physicians. Nurses often face very high demands but have less autonomy in patient care decisions compared to physicians.
Right. Right. And the material notes that this job strain isn't just like psychological, it has concrete impacts.
Exactly. The sources link it directly to physiological issues like cardiovascular problems,
Or
gastrointestinal problems,
Wow.
and also job-related issues such as low motivation and, unsurprisingly, job dissatisfaction. A powerful model for understanding that specific imbalance.
Okay. What about the effort-reward imbalance model? That sounds like it speaks to maybe fairness?
It absolutely does, yeah.
Yeah.
This model posits that stress occurs when there's a significant imbalance between the effort you put in and the rewards you get back.
Makes sense.
And rewards aren't just, money. They include things like recognition, status, job security,
Right.
that kind of thing.
Right.
So when you put in high effort but feel the rewards are low, the sources suggest this imbalance is highly distressing.
Yeah, that resonates. If you feel like you're constantly going above and beyond, but seeing colleagues who seem less effortful get the promotions or praise, that imbalance could be a huge source of stress.
It really could. It threatens your sense of self-efficacy and fairness. And finally, the sources mention the organizational injustice model.
Okay.
This one centers on the perception of unfairness within the organization, whether it's in how decisions are made, that's procedural justice, how outcomes are distributed, distributive justice, or how people are treated interpersonally, interactional justice.
So if you feel like promotion decisions are totally arbitrary, or maybe that managers treat some employees with respect but others poorly, that itself is framed as a source of stress in this model.
Precisely. It's not just feeling wronged, it's the stress inherent in working in an environment that you perceive as unjust.
Okay.
And moving beyond these models, the sources also highlight that certain occupations just seem to be particularly prone to these kinds of stresses.
Yeah, I saw that. Are there any specific types of jobs that the sources call out as like consistently high stress?
Definitely. Roles involving high responsibility, lots of public interaction, or erratic work hours feature prominently.
Like first responders.
Exactly. Police officers and firefighters, for instance. They deal with situations that can range from monotonous waiting to sudden high-danger events.
Yeah.
And the material notes potentially higher rates of issues like divorce and alcoholism in these professions, which some link back to the job stress.
I can absolutely see that connection with the unpredictable nature of the work.
And people-facing roles are also highlighted as frequently stressful. Teachers, social workers, healthcare professionals, like nurses.
Right.
Nurses, as we mentioned with the demands control model, often face high demands, often limited control, and then you add the complexity of shift work and difficult patient interactions.
It's a lot. You mentioned physicians earlier, though, and how one study in the sources found they reported higher emotional stress than nurses, despite potentially having more decision latitude. That seems...
Well, counterintuitive based on the demands control model alone.
It does, doesn't it?
Do the sources offer any insights into why that might be the case? What other factors might be in play for roles like physicians? Yeah, that finding is intriguing, and it really underscores that no single model tells the whole story. The sources don't explicitly detail why in that specific study comparison, but they suggest that factors like the stakes involved,
Ah, okay.
the sheer weight of responsibility for patient outcomes, the emotional intensity of critical decisions.
Life and death sometimes.
Right. And potentially the pressure of managing teams or dealing with complex organizational systems, all those could contribute to physicians' stress, perhaps overriding the benefit of higher decision control in certain dimensions, like emotional strain.
So the nature and consequences of the demands matter hugely, not just the volume or control.
Exactly. The complexity itself, and perhaps surprisingly to some, clerical and secretarial work is also listed as highly stressful in the sources.
Really? Why is that?
Often linked to high work overload and a perceived lack of control over their workflow or priorities. One study mentioned specific findings linking it to higher rates of coronary heart disease in women clerical workers compared to homemakers.
Wow.
Managers, too, they report high stress, often tied to workload, role ambiguity in their own positions, and the stress of managing difficult interpersonal relationships within their teams.
Yeah, managing people isn't easy.
Definitely not. And the sources link this to potential increases in anxiety, depression, even alcohol consumption if coping isn't great.
So it seems the specific flavor of stress really depends on the job itself, but the presence of stress is well, widespread. And the sources go into quite a bit of detail about the health consequences. How does work stress actually impact our physical well-being according to this material?
Well, this is where the connection becomes quite stark, actually. The jog demands control model is often cited in this context.
Okay.
The sources reference a meta-analysis suggesting work stress contributes an extra, get this, 50% excess risk for coronary heart
Or
disease.
2%. Wow, that's a massive increase in risk just from job stress.
It's significant. And the Interheart study findings discussed in the sources are also striking. Workers reporting permanent stress at work were more than twice as likely to have experienced a myocardial infarction, a heart attack, compared to matched individuals without that level of stress.
Twice as likely. That's huge.
Yeah. And the Whitehall-Tuah study, looking at British civil servants, added further support. It showed a clear dose-response relationship, meaning higher levels of work stress were associated with a greater risk of coronary heart disease events. The more stress, the higher the risk.
And the Whitehall study also looked at the biological side, right? Finding higher morning cortisol levels in high-stress workers. Which isn't surprising, given cortisol is the stress hormone.
Exactly. And they also noted that about a third of the increased risk could be explained by negative health behaviors, things like poor diet, low physical activity.
Stress eating, skipping the gym.
Pretty much, along with factors like metabolic syndrome.
Okay, so it's both direct physiological pathways and indirect pathways via lifestyle choices, which are themselves influenced by stress.
That seems to be the picture, yes. The sources even point to a study where work stress seemed to accelerate the progression of coronary artery disease in women who had already experienced an acute cardiac event.
So it makes existing problems worse, faster.
It appears so. And while the precise biological links are complex, involving the nervous system, hormones, inflammation, immunity, all that, the sources strongly support a substantial link between chronic work stress and cardiovascular health.
It's clearly more than just feeling a bit tense then. Beyond the general daily stress, the sources really highlight work schedules, particularly shift work, as a major factor. What's the big issue with working outside that standard, 9 to 5?
Well, the primary problem highlighted is the disruption of our circadian rhythm.
Our internal body clock.
Exactly, our internal 24-hour biological clock. It's synchronized by light and darkness, and it regulates pretty much everything from sleep-wake cycles to hormone release and body temperature. So, working against this natural rhythm, as shift workers have to do, can lead to chronic fatigue, sleep loss, impaired cognitive function. It messes with your social life. And a whole range of physical health problems.
And what kinds of health issues do the sources most frequently link to shift work specifically?
Gastrointestinal issues seem very prevalent in the material. Things like disturbances in appetite, irregular bowel movements, increased heartburn, and even higher rates of chronic gastritis and peptic ulcers are noted.
Wow.
The sources suggest this is largely due to the disruption of the body's natural cycles and the sleep deprivation, rather than just, say, poor eating habits during odd hours.
Okay. And does that cardiovascular risk we just talked about, does that extend to shift work specifically?
Absolutely. A review mentioned in the sources found shift workers have about a 40% higher chance of developing cardiovascular disease compared to day workers.
40% higher. Still significant.
Very. And working excessively long hours, say over 60 a week, especially when combined with lack of sleep, is also associated with an increased risk of myocardial infarction.
Yeah.
The material even references karoshi, the Japanese term for death from overwork, which really highlights the extreme end of this spectrum.
So it's not just inconvenience, it's a serious health factor. And here's something that really caught my attention in the sources. This potential link between night shift work and cancer risk. How do the sources explain that connection? That seems like a surprising jump.
It does seem like a big jump, I agree, but the sources present a pretty compelling hypothesis centered around the hormone melatonin.
Okay, melatonin.
Sleep hormone, right.
Primarily known for that, yes. It's mainly released by the pineal gland during periods of darkness, peaking at night, critical for regulating sleep. But the sources highlight its other roles, including inhibiting estrogen production and possessing anti-cancer properties, potentially slowing the growth of certain tumors. Okay, so if you're exposed to artificial light at night, like working under bright lights in a hospital or a factory, what happens to melatonin production?
That light exposure suppresses it, reduces it significantly.
Right.
And with reduced melatonin, the sources suggest two main things might happen. Indirectly, The lack of melatonin means less inhibition of estrogen, which could increase the risk for hormone-sensitive cancers, like breast cancer.
Oh.
And directly, lower melatonin means losing its protective anti-cancer effects.
Wow, that's fascinating. So, light exposure at night messes with a hormone that helps regulate both sleep and potentially tumor growth.
That's the hypothesis presented exactly.
Yeah.
The sources also note studies showing lower melatonin levels in patients with colorectal cancer
Hmm.
and suggest that the chronic sleep deprivation inherent in shift work might contribute to cancer risk through other pathways as well, maybe like suppressing the immune system.
It's complex.
Very complex link, but the material clearly points to it as a serious concern associated with shift work.
Okay, so work structure, specific jobs, even the timing of our work all contribute significantly to stress and health risks. Let's talk about a term that's become, well, ubiquitous: burnout. What is burnout based on how the sources define it?
Well, the sources present a couple of influential perspectives. Ari Shiram defines burnout as an effective reaction to ongoing stress.
Effective reaction, so emotional.
Yeah, primarily emotional. It's characterized by the gradual depletion of a person's energetic resources,
Okay.
manifesting as emotional exhaustion, physical fatigue, and cognitive weariness. It's seen as a process that develops over time, not like a single event.
So it's not just feeling tired after a long week, it's a deeper, more persistent draining of your batteries, essentially.
Right. And the opposite of burnout in Shiram's view is vigor, feeling emotionally energetic, physically strong, cognitively alert, often linked to meaningful work, challenge, success.
Okay. And there's another model too, right? Maslach's.
Yes, Christina Maslach offers a slightly different but complementary three-dimensional model. It's probably the most widely used one. She describes burnout as consisting of emotional exhaustion, cynicism, and reduced efficacy.
Okay, break those down. Emotional exhaustion is that feeling of being drained and depleted we just talked about?
Yes, exactly. Often from excessive workload or maybe interpersonal conflict. This is the core energy drain dimension.
Got it.
Then cynicism, which is sometimes called depersonalization, is the development of a negative, detached, or sort of overly professional attitude towards clients or colleagues.
Ah, like putting up walls.
Yeah, it's often seen as a coping mechanism to buffer against that emotional drain, but it represents a loss of idealism, a detachment.
That's the interpersonal aspect. And then reduced efficacy.
That's feeling a diminished sense of competence and achievement in your work. You feel less capable, less productive than you were before. That's the self-evaluation dimension. And Maslach also contrasts burnout with engagement, which is characterized by high energy, strong involvement, and a sense of effectiveness. The opposite state.
The sources also seem to clarify that while burnout and depression share symptoms like fatigue, burnout is generally seen as specific to the work context, right? Whereas depression is more pervasive across life domains.
That's an important distinction they make, yes.
And the material suggests that advanced burnout doesn't necessarily lead straight to clinical depression. It might manifest purely as that really hardened cynicism towards work or clients.
Right. And similar to work stress in general and shift work, the sources detail significant health links associated with burnout itself.
Yeah, you mentioned vital exhaustion earlier when we were prepping. How does that relate to burnout, and what health risks does the material connect it to?
Vital exhaustion is described as a state highly correlated with burnout. It's characterized by a low energy state, increased irritability, and sleep disturbances.
That's a lot like burnout.
Very similar, yes. The sources specifically link vital exhaustion to an increased risk of cardiovascular heart disease and even fatal myocardial infarction.
So that energy depletion aspect, again, has serious physical consequences.
It certainly seems so. Studies using Shiram's measure of burnout also show a relative risk for coronary heart disease and MI. And while there's overlap with depression measures, which are also linked to heart disease, the material presents evidence that burnout itself connects to various risk factors. Things like metabolic syndrome, dysregulation of the body's stress response system, sleep problems, inflammation, impaired immunity, and just fostering poor health behaviors.
And it's not just heart problems, is it? The sources mention burnout linked to developing type 2 diabetes
Yes.
and musculoskeletal pain, and there's a rather stark finding cited about causes of death among burned out workers.
Yes, that study was quite sobering. It noted increased mortality among burned out individuals from causes including alcohol use-related issues, coronary artery disease, suicide, accidents, and even lung and breast cancer. It really reinforces just how deeply burnout can impact overall health and longevity.
Okay. Given these pervasive and frankly quite serious impacts, What do the sources suggest organizations and individuals can actually do about work stress and burnout? Let's start with what the material says about prevention and treatment strategies.
Right. Well, the sources do note that the empirical evidence base is surprisingly limited for many interventions, which is interesting in itself.
Hmm,
But they outline common strategies. For organizations, preventing burnout might involve things like hiring more staff to alleviate overload,
makes sense.
providing thorough job orientations to manage expectations early on, giving timely and constructive feedback to address that low-efficacy feeling,
Hmm.
fostering social support groups, and maybe implementing cognitive restructuring programs.
And the sources mention that cognitive restructuring, teaching workers to kind of reframe their thoughts and expectations about work, did show some evidence in one study for reducing emotional exhaustion, but not necessarily the cynicism or reduced efficacy aspects of burnout.
That's right, which really highlights the complexity, doesn't it? You can't
No.
just think your way out of all aspects of it.
Right.
Beyond organizational efforts, the material strongly emphasizes the importance of self-care. This is where the individual takes deliberate action.
Okay, and what kind of self-care actions does the material suggest are important?
Well, things like staying self-aware of your stress levels, using humor, prioritizing quality time with loved ones, engaging in wellness activities.
Like exercise, hobbies?
Exactly. Taking vacations, actual vacations. Continuously developing professionally, seeking support from mentors, exercising control where you possibly can,
Right.
and crucially, maintaining a healthy work-life balance. It's really about actively recharging and protecting your personal resources.
So it's kind of a dual approach then. Organizations have a role in structuring work differently, and individuals have a role in managing their response and energy levels.
That seems to be the gist of it.
Shifting gears slightly, the sources also talk about something very practical: time management. How is that presented as a tool against stress?
Well, time management is framed as a pretty direct way to reduce stress by getting a handle on workload and deadlines.
Makes sense.
Better management of time is said to improve productivity and, importantly, free up time for that recovery and leisure we just mentioned. But before jumping into strategies, the sources identify common time wasters.
Ah, yes. What are the usual suspects that eat up our time without us realizing it, according to the material?
Well, a big one is lack of clear goals, essentially just reacting to things as they come rather than working towards specific outcomes.
Being reactive, not proactive.
Exactly. But on the flip side, having too many goals can also be a time waster, leading to overload and fatigue. Procrastination is heavily featured,
Classic.
delaying those aversive tasks, sometimes getting a rush from the last-minute pressure, but ultimately just increasing stress.
Ah, yes, the classic procrastinator who spends hours tidying their desk to avoid starting the difficult report. We've all been there.
Haven't we just? Perfectionism is another one, getting bogged down in excessive detail on minor tasks, endlessly reviewing things, losing sight of the bigger picture.
Right, the 80-20 rule gets forgotten.
Precisely. And finally, constant work interruptions, phone calls, unscheduled visitors, email notifications, Slack pings, all that stuff,
Yeah.
which break concentration and momentum, especially on complex work.
Okay, so awareness of these traps is key. What actual strategies do the sources suggest for better time management?
Well, while noting there's maybe limited rigorous empirical studies on the effectiveness of time management training itself,
Interesting.
the sources outline logical and popular strategies. Keeping a daily time log for a period is recommended just to get an accurate picture of where your time actually goes.
Like tracking your spending, but for time.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
Establishing clear goals and then prioritizing them is fundamental. Often using a simple to-do list with maybe an ABC priority system.
A being the highest priority tasks with significant consequences, B important but less critical, and C the lowest priority or routine stuff.
Correct. They also mentioned the Pareto principle, that 80-20 rule you just brought up, focusing your time on the 20% of tasks or goals
Yeah.
that generate 80% of the value.
Right, high leverage activities.
Exactly. Strategies also include processing information like paper or email only once. Decide immediately. File it, act on it, or discard it.
The touch it once rule.
That's the one. Setting clear boundaries is crucial too. Closing your office door sometimes, scheduling specific blocks for email or phone calls, turning off notifications to combat that technostress and digital overload.
And delegating tasks seems like a key one too, right? Especially those lower priority C tasks to free up time for the high value A tasks.
Absolutely, if you're in a position to delegate. And importantly, the sources stress scheduling time for relaxation and breaks, even when the workload is high.
That seems counterintuitive when you're swamped.
It does, but they use the analogy of the lumberjack, who was so busy chopping wood, he didn't have time to sharpen his axe.
Ah, good one.
Time management isn't just about raw efficiency. It's about working sustainably and making sure you recharge.
That's a great way to frame it, managing energy and focus, not just minutes. Okay, moving beyond just mitigating stress, the sources also explore the concept of job-related well-being. What makes a job contribute positively to our lives, according to this material, not just neutral, but actually good?
Right. The sources suggest that while managing stress might get you to a kind of neutral state, true job well-being involves adding positive experiences and feelings.
Okay.
They connect well-being to experiencing flow. That state of complete absorption in a task that is challenging, but where you feel competent and in control.
Where you lose track of time because you're so engaged, like you're in the zone.
Exactly that feeling. They also link it to self-determination theory, which suggests well-being is fostered when we are intrinsically motivated towards realistic goals that we have some autonomy in choosing.
So internal motivation and choice.
Yeah. So a job contributes to well-being if it provides opportunities for flow, if it supports the pursuit of personally meaningful goals, allows for positive social connections with colleagues, and provides a sense of making good progress.
The sources even list specific environmental factors that contribute to well-being. There are about 10 of them, if I remember correctly.
That's right, yeah. It was a summary of research on what makes a job psychologically healthy. They include things like opportunity for personal control and autonomy.
We saw that with the demands control model.
Exactly. Using and developing skills, having clear and reasonable goals with sufficient resources to achieve them.
Uh-huh.
Variety in tasks, environmental clarity like getting feedback, feeling secure, adequate financial reward relative to your peers.
Okay.
Physical security and a safe, comfortable environment. Supportive supervision, that's a big one. Opportunity for positive social relationships. And having a valued social position or a job with real meaning.
That list really paints a clear picture of what a job needs to offer to be truly positive, going way beyond just a paycheck.
It does. It sets a high bar.
Finally, let's look at the broader picture of what the sources suggest organizations can do systemically to address work stress, the different levels of intervention they talked about.
Right. The material categorizes interventions into 3 levels of prevention. Primary prevention is presented as the ideal.
Okay.
It aims to eliminate or minimize the sources of stress in the first place and foster a positive organizational culture overall.
So this would involve things like actually conducting stress audits to find the problems, and then changing policies, maybe improving communication channels, redesigning jobs that are just overly demanding, or giving employees more autonomy.
Precisely. Those kinds of systemic changes. The sources indicate that there's generally good evidence suggesting primary prevention strategies like these can be effective in reducing objective indicators of stress, like high blood pressure or rates of sick leave.
Okay, so tackling the root cause works. What's next?
Secondary prevention. This is focused on equipping employees with skills to manage stress after they encounter it.
So this is like training and relaxation techniques, time management workshops, maybe assertiveness training, or broader lifestyle management programs.
Yes, exactly those kinds of things. But while these are popular, the sources point out a shortage of methodologically strong research evaluating their long-term impact. Any measured benefits often aren't maintained much beyond, say, 6 months, which suggests that just teaching coping skills has limitations if the fundamental stressors in the environment aren't addressed.
That makes intuitive sense, doesn't it? You can teach someone to swim, but if you keep throwing them into rougher and rougher water, they're still going to struggle eventually.
Exactly. And that leads us to tertiary prevention. This level focuses on providing rehabilitation and recovery for employees who have already developed health issues or burnout as a result of chronic stress.
Okay, the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, so to speak.
Yeah.
The Employee Assistance Program, or EAP, is given as a key example here, right?
Right. EAPs typically offer confidential counseling, information, and referrals for a whole range of personal and work-related problems.
Are they effective?
Well, the sources mentioned that while employee satisfaction with EAPs tends to be high, it's actually challenging to draw general conclusions about their overall effectiveness based on the limited rigorous evaluation research available, often due to confidentiality issues and study design limitations.
Right. Hard to measure objectively sometimes. So it seems like the sources generally favor tackling the problem at the source, primary prevention, whenever possible, with tertiary prevention being necessary when prevention fails.
That seems fair. And there's one final point in the sources worth mentioning: A note about a positive psychology approach to stress.
Okay.
Instead of solely focusing on preventing distress, bad stress organizations could also work to generate eustress.
Eustress, positive stress.
Yeah, seen as the positive, growth-oriented stress linked to engagement and challenge. This involves focusing on factors like meaningfulness, manageability, hope, and that vigor we talked about earlier.
Uh-huh.
And it might involve strategies like helping employees set meaningful goals or redesigning jobs to be more inherently engaging and rewarding, not just less stressful.
So it's a shift from just patching problems to actively cultivating well-being and engagement. That feels like a pretty comprehensive sweep through the material you shared.
It really does. We've covered a lot of ground.
Mm-hmm.
Moved from defining work stress and exploring different models like role conflict or the demands control idea,
Mm-hmm.
looked at how stress manifests in specific jobs, and detailed those really serious health impacts, from cardiovascular disease to GI issues, and that surprising link to certain cancers, particularly with shift work.
We also unpacked what burnout is, its different dimensions, emotional exhaustion, cynicism, reduced efficacy, and the significant health risks associated with it. Before looking at the strategies the sources suggest for both organizations and individuals to prevent or manage it.
Right. And we touched on practical time management techniques and identified those common time-wasting behaviors we all fall into sometimes.
Yeah.
And we discussed what the sources say makes a job contribute positively to well-being, going beyond just the absence of stress, to include factors like autonomy, skill use, relationships, meaning. And finally, we explored those different levels of intervention organizations might implement, primary, secondary, tertiary.
Yeah. This deep dive into the material makes it incredibly clear that work stress is, well, it's a complex, pervasive issue with really profound effects, not just on our daily experience, but on our long-term health and even potentially our mortality.
Absolutely. It's not trivial stuff.
Not at all. So here's a final provocative thought for you, our listener, to consider, drawing directly from the substantial health implications discussed in these sources. Given the significant health impacts associated with work stress described in the material, I mean, from those startling increases in cardiovascular disease risk to the concerning link to certain cancers and shift workers, and the myriad physical effects of burnout, does the sheer collective burden of work stress mean we need a fundamental rethinking? Not just of how individuals cope with demanding jobs, but how jobs and organizations themselves are structured and managed in the first place. As some of the models and those primary intervention strategies discussed here might imply.
It's a big question. And understanding these intricate connections, as laid out in the material you provided, is really essential, I think, for navigating the demands of the modern workplace effectively.